Good morning and welcome back. You're watching World Talks here on TV World. I'm Stalia Stremska. Polls have opened in Moldova, with voters choosing who will head the country in the second round presidential election. During the first round of voting on the 20th of October, incumbent Maia Sandu led with 42% of the vote, but failed to win an outright majority, while Russia-friendly former Prosecutor General Alexandr Stoianoglo took 26%. To discuss this pivotal election, I am joined here this morning by Rasmus Nilsson, lecturer at UCL. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. So, in the first round of the presidential elections 2 weeks ago, an unprecedented number of candidates took part. It was 11 to be exact. So now we have only 2. And so what happened to the support base of the other 9? Did they endorse anyone, either Sandu or Stoianoglu?
It differs a bit from candidate to candidate. The sort of more consequential people among those who fell out, they seem to be supporting Stoianoglo. That's certainly what they've been saying. But it's not a uniform picture.
Right. So, I mean, what are your predictions as to today's vote?
Well, I still think just about it's more likely that Sandu will gain re-election, but it is absolutely possible that she could lose, that Stoianoglo could win. I think a lot also will depend, and I've said this before, I think on this channel, a lot will depend on the turnout that comes up. If there's a large turnout, particularly of Moldovans in the diaspora, then I would imagine Sandu stands a better chance. If there's a lower turnout, particularly abroad, then I think Stoianoglo could well win.
So lately we've been discussing alleged Russian interference in elections in general, most recently in Georgia, but also here in Moldova. So how does the case look like in Moldova? We have figures such as Ilan Shaw and people meddling. What is the picture there?
Oh, I think there's no doubt that Russia and Russian-affiliated actors have tried to influence the election, just as they tried to influence the first round of the presidential election and, of course, the EU referendum we had recently in Moldova. So I don't think there's any doubt about that. As I've said before, however, I think the bigger challenge, the bigger risk for Maia Sandu is the socio-economic situation. The fact that Moldova, although its economy has seen significant gains in recent years, the economy still isn't where it should be, and people are still not feeling the benefits, people on the street. And I think that's a bigger challenge for her than interference from abroad. But certainly Russia and its allies are trying to, well, create discord, but also to get rid of Sandu if they can.
Right, and we know that at some polling stations, officials suspected of bribery were already removed. But I wonder if there will be more precautionary measures introduced today. I mean, from perhaps international watchdogs, how to ensure transparency of today's vote.
Well, I think now that the vote is ongoing, I think it is more limited what you can actually do on the street. Obviously, there will be some surveillance of voting places to make sure nothing untoward is going on. And obviously, international observers are looking very closely at this election. But I think right now, frankly, we are in a situation where we will have to let the election take its course. I think it's just as important that the EU comes out, and international observers more generally, come out quickly upon the conclusion of this election to state any concerns they may have, and so far as it is possible, but I certainly expect it to be possible, that they come out quickly and state their acceptance of the result and their acceptance of the overall findings of the election.
Right, so let's speculate a little bit about different scenarios. So what could happen to Moldova if Alexandr Stoianoglo wins?
Well, if Alexandr Stoianoglo wins, it's of course the case that Moldova's EU course will be less clear, less guaranteed. I mean, he has shown himself to be much more, let's say, understanding of the Russian position than Maia Sandu has. Having said that, Alexandr Stoianoglo has shown signs in past years that he's willing to take, if you like, have a working relationship with the European Union. I think if the European Union can continue to show Moldova and Moldovans that it's there to support the country and support its economic progress, then I would suspect that someone like Stoianoglo could also be persuaded that closer relations with the EU might be to his political advantage. Yes, it will go more slowly than if Sandu wins, but I don't think it's game over in any way for Moldova and EU relations if Stoianoglo should win.
Okay, this is quite uplifting. But what about Russia's potential reaction to this? And what about breakaway regions in Moldova, such as Transnistria?
I mean, there's no doubt that should Stoianoglo win, for instance, there's no doubt that Russia would claim that as a victory for the Russian cause, and there's no doubt that they would seek to have some sort of symbolic meeting or symbolic interaction with Stoianoglo fairly quickly. Whether that would go much beyond symbolics, I doubt, also because it is limited what Russia right now can offer Moldova compared to what Romania and the wider EU can offer the country. Um, in terms of what should we say? In terms of further risks going into the winter, I think everything depends on, of course, that Moldovans will continue getting relatively affordable energy, and that goes for a place like Transnistria as well. That goes for a place like for an area like Gagauzia as well. And again, here I would expect and I would hope, going up to the parliamentary elections next year, I would hope that the EU would be pushing the narrative and pushing the aid into Moldova, for instance, with energy, so that you can have, if you like, a smooth transition from one Moldovan regime to another, from Sandu to Stoianoglu, should that happen, so that Moldovans can see, look, EU's assistance, unlike Russian assistance, EU's assistance is not fickle. Now, if you can send that message that EU is there to support Moldova as long as Moldova continues to reform its state and its economy, then I think not only Moldova but also Transnistria and even Gagauzia will start looking to the EU and say, well, that is where our future lies.
Right, and of course, presidential election is one thing, and you've already mentioned the parliamentary elections taking place in Moldova next year in July of 2025. So I wonder, even if Maia Sandu wins, she has very little time to impose, sort of introduce reforms. Perhaps there could be a change of government next year. Will there be a change? What are your predictions?
It's still a little bit early to give clear predictions for the parliamentary election and the next government. Having said that, I think it is quite likely that the current government will face difficulties in that election. And that's another reason why I think it's incredibly important that the EU signals to all parties in Moldova right now that as long, we in the West, in the EU, we're not focused on who sits at the top in Moldovan politics. We're focused on the reforms taking place. We're focusing on concrete steps taken by whatever Moldovan government may be in place, concrete steps that leads Moldova closer into the European family and closer towards a reformed country, a well-governed country. That is the message we have to send out so that the EU can work with any responsible partner which triumphs in next year's elections. I think that's really the only reasonable way forward for the EU.
Right, but on the other hand, if Stoianoglu wins or will appear to win, don't you think that there will be a closer look at the actual results and at the process itself? Perhaps the results will be questioned or something of the sort. Do you expect this kind of?
Yes, of course, that can happen. And I mean, we've seen in recent days, you will have seen as well, the comparisons made, for instance, with Georgia, where there are consistent doubts now about the election that took place. Having said that, in Moldova, you do have a government in place which is generally well regarded in the West, which is seen as a government trying to present fair elections. We saw it recently with the EU referendum, which was held, I think, to the best of the government's abilities. So I think in the Moldovan case, although you can have and probably will have voting irregularities today, overall, I would expect that election to be held in a much more transparent and responsible way than we've seen elsewhere, for instance, in Georgia. Therefore, although individual election areas, election districts in Moldova might see irregularities, I would suspect that the overall election today will be held reasonably well, and that the West therefore will be able to recognize this, even if Stoianoglu should end up winning. I still don't think that's the most likely thing. But if he does, and the general tenor of the election is that it was held in a transparent, fair manner, then the West will have to recognize Stoianoglu's victory. Then we will have to look at what reforms he's willing to continue.
Right, and you said that the EU should work with whomever wins, regardless of their political preferences and so on. But I wonder, do we have examples of EU behaving in this manner in case of other countries? Because, we have countries like Turkey or Serbia that were supposed to be on the path towards the EU, but then because of their close ties with Russia, it was slowed down. So I wonder if we can find examples where it worked.
Well, I mean, I take your warning in the sense that if we take the case of Serbia, for instance, and arguably Turkey as well, the problems were not simply that these countries had some relations with Russia. It was that reforms in these countries, necessary reforms, were not carried out or have been very slow in being carried out. And I will agree to the extent that the EU has previously shown itself to be, you might even say, naive in terms of being promised things from candidate countries and then not seeing those things delivered. So the EU absolutely has to continue, whether Sandu gets re-election or whether Stoianoglo comes in. The EU has to be quite strict in terms of its relations with Moldova, asking and expecting Moldova to stick to the promises already given, to the reforms already started. What I'm stressing, though, is that the EU has to focus on the reforms. It should not focus on individuals. And I think previously, if we look at some of the other cases like Serbia and like Turkey, the EU may have become too fixated on individual people's promises, individual leaders' promises, instead of looking closely on the ground at what was actually being undertaken by the regimes, local regimes, what was being undertaken or what was not being undertaken. And all I'm saying here is that no matter who wins in today's election in Moldova, the EU has to look at the reforms in the country and make sure that they are carried out and continuously keep a focus and keep an interest on the country.
Right, and sort of speaking about EU's expansion, the European Commission has recently published this report on the progress made by countries which are in the pipeline to join the EU, so to speak. So how do you view this report? I mean, some countries performed better, some others are lagging behind. What is your assessment of this?
My assessment is that it looks like a reasonable report. My assessment is that it looks like the EU actually inquired quite closely about what was going on in these countries. And I am very heartened, and this I think is progress for the EU. I am heartened that the EU is now willing, as you indicated now, to distinguish between countries and distinguish between countries based on their actual performance. If you go back some years, the EU did sometimes have a tendency to look at countries in Central Eastern Europe as a bloc, and everybody in many cases had to join, or the body had to join the EU or not. The EU has become more realistic now and also more sort of able to distinguish the specifics of each country and each country on its own merits. I think this is a responsible thing to do. I think this is the respectful thing to do as well towards the countries, so that, again, if you're in Moldova, for instance, you know that if you carry out reasonable reforms, you will be judged on those. You won't have to be dragged along with other countries that might be more slow in coming.
And just to round up our discussion, how significant, how important it is for the EU, in your opinion, to sort of broaden its sphere of influence? And I mean, of course, to include countries such as Moldova, possibly Serbia, and so on.
I think it depends on what you believe the EU is there for. If you're thinking about the EU as an organization that should first and foremost get its everyday sort of governance in order, that should be looking at day-to-day affairs, then I think the EU right now has quite significant challenges internally. And if you're in Brussels, I think lots of people in Brussels would be looking at those day-to-day challenges and think those more important than say whether Moldova can join the organization or not. However, if you're someone like me, and if you take a more strategic view of what the EU should be there for, if you still believe that the EU is not there to be a technocratic body, but is there to continually support and construct peace in Europe, if you're that kind of person, then you would think like me that EU membership for countries like Moldova, countries like Ukraine, countries on the Western Balkans is of prime importance, because it spreads a security community, it spreads an international society focused on mutual understanding and mutual knowledge. If you're like me, therefore, you would think that this is very important. I am confident that there are plenty of people in the EU who think like this as well, and hopefully developments in Moldova and similar countries in coming days and coming years, hopefully developments will underscore and will support such people and support the EU's strategic mission.
And I think this is a great conclusion to our talk. Thank you so much. Rasmus Nilsson, lecturer at University College London, was my guest this morning.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World News Bulletin coming right up.